to have been to a ruined wedding. What happened? Let me tell you about my dad and stepmom's wedding. You know those cringe-worthy moments on reality shows where you're watching, almost wincing, but you can't look away? Yeah, this wedding was that. But honestly, considering their story, it was like watching a car crash you saw coming from miles away, but were powerless to stop. If you had known what they'd been through, maybe, just maybe, you'd have seen it coming too. I guess to really understand why this day was such a disaster, you've got to start with my stepmom's life before she ever met my dad. Now, when I say she had a rough upbringing, I'm not exaggerating. Her childhood was something straight out of a bad TV drama, but it wasn't fiction for her. It was real life. Her dad, the man was a monster. I never met him, but from what I've heard, that's probably for the best. He was abusive, not just physically, but emotionally. Constantly belittling her, putting her down, making her feel like she was worth less than the dirt on his shoes. He controlled every part of her life. What she wore, who she talked to, where she went, nothing was off limits. Then there was her mom. If her dad was bad, her mom wasn't much better. Not abusive in the same way, but she had her own demons. She was an alcoholic, checked out most of the time, more interested in her next drink than in being a mother. The way my stepmom described it, she was invisible in that house, except when she was being punished for something. As you can imagine, growing up in that environment wasn't exactly nurturing. Eventually, her parents divorced, and her mom remarried, bringing in a new cast of characters into the chaos that was already her life. Her stepdad? Let's just say he didn't care much about her either. It was all about his new wife, my stepmom's mother, and he seemed to see her as an inconvenience more than anything. So by the time she hit 15, my stepmom had had enough. I mean, who wouldn't want to run away from that night? She was desperate to escape. And in her teenage mind, she thought she found a way out. And that's where my dad comes into the picture. Now, my dad wasn't exactly Prince Charming. Far from it. He was 26 when they met, and let's just say he had his own issues. To be blunt, he wasn't a good guy. Sure, he could be charming when he wanted to be, but underneath that charm was someone manipulative, controlling, and downright mean when the mood struck him. And believe me, the mood struck him off. I don't know what it was that drew her to him. Maybe she thought he was her ticket out, or maybe she saw something in him that reminded her of the men in her life. It's weird how people can be drawn to the familiar, even when the familiar is bad for them. Anyway, they started a relationship. She thought she was escaping one nightmare, but in reality, she was just walking into another one. My dad could be abusive too, emotionally, if not physically. He knew how to tear a person down with just his words. It wasn't that he was always like that. There were good moments, sure, but the bad moments, those were the ones that stuck. And my stepmom, well, she was used to bad moments. So she stayed. On top of all that, my dad had his own family drama that complicated things even further. He had a deep-seated hatred for his mother. I never fully understood why, but it was like everything wrong in his life could be traced back to her in his mind. Every failure, every disappointment, it was all her fault. That resentment bled into every relationship he had with a woman. It was like he was punishing them for whatever he thought his mom had done to him, and that included my stepmom. So yeah, by the time the wedding rolled around, things were already a mess. You could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just a normal wedding day stress. It was like everyone knew something was about to go wrong, but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. The day started off shaky, and it only got worse from there. First off, the venue. They had picked this small, run-down banquet hall that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The walls were this awful beige color, and the carpet, oh man, that carpet, was this hideous mix of brown and green, with stains that had clearly been there for years. It felt like the kind of place you'd expect to see a high school reunion, or maybe a budget office party, but a wedding? Not so much. When my stepmom walked down the aisle, I remember thinking she looked nervous. Not the normal wedding day jitters kind of nervous, but like she knew something was about to go horribly wrong. And she wasn't the only. My dad, standing up there in his ill-fitting tux, looked more like he was waiting for a court sentencing than his own wedding. I don't know what he was thinking, but he didn't look happy to be there. And the guests? Well, let's just say the guest list was a who's who of dysfunctional family members and old friends with grudges. My dad's side of the family barely spoke to each other. His brothers and sisters were scattered throughout the room, giving each other side-eye like they were just waiting for someone to say the wrong thing. My stepmom's family wasn't any better. Her mom showed up late, already a few drinks in, and her stepdad barely acknowledged her. It was like watching a room full of people trying to pretend they weren't about to explode. Then came the ceremony. Oh boy! If you've ever been to a wedding where the vows feel more like a formality than a heartfelt exchange, then you've got some idea of what this was like. My dad's vows? He mumbled his way through them like he was reading a grocery list. My stepmom? She tried, bless her, but you could hear her voice shaking. It was like she knew deep down that she was making a mistake, but she was too far in to back out now. When the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, there was this awkward pause, and I swear, for a split second it looked like my stepmom was going to say something, but then she didn't. She just stood frozen, and the moment passed. It all started the moment my stepmom took her first step down the aisle. She'd been trying to reconnect with her biological dad in the months leading up to the wedding, which, if you knew her history, was a big deal. Her relationship with her stepdad had gone to hell, and she was desperate for some kind of fatherly connection, someone to give her the emotional stability she craved. So, against her better judgment, she asked her dad to walk her down the aisle, hoping maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of something positive between them. But as you might have guessed by now, it wasn't exactly the fairy tale moment she had hoped for. This was an outdoor wedding. Beautiful in theory, but full of hidden dangers if you weren't paying attention. So there they are, walking down the aisle she's trying to keep it together, to pretend everything's perfect. The guests are seated, watching her with those hopeful, expectant smiles. You know, like this is the moment that defines happiness. And then, right in their path, there's this low-hanging branch. Nothing major. Just enough to be an annoyance. Her dad reaches up, pushes it aside like a gentleman, and for a second it looks like things might go smoothly. But no. The branch snaps back with the kind of timing you only see in slapstick comedies, and it hits her dead in the face. Now, if you didn't know her dad, you'd probably expect him to apologize, right? I mean, that's what a normal person would do. But no. Instead, this guy bursts out laughing. I'm talking full-on, knee-slapping laughter like he's just seen the best joke of his life. And to make matters worse, my stepmom, trying so hard not to ruin the moment, chuckles along, but you can see it in her eyes. The embarrassment, the hurt, all of it just bubbling under the surface. She knows if she reacts, if she lets herself be angry, it's only going to escalate. Her dad had this tendency to flip, go from laughing to lashing out in an instant, so she did what she'd always done. She swallowed it down and kept walking. That was strike one, and the ceremony hadn't even started yet. They made it to the altar, and the ceremony itself, well, it was awkward, to say the least. There's this tension you can feel between the two of them. My dad was standing there, stiff as a board, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, and my stepmom, well, she was trying to keep it together, but that branch incident had already rattled her, and it showed. Her vows came out shaky, her hands trembling as she held onto her bouquet like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. And just like that, it was over. They were married. You'd think things couldn't get worse from there, but oh, they did. So after the ceremony, we move on to the reception. They had it set up in this big old barn that someone had spruced up for the occasion. It was supposed to be rustic and charming, but really, it just looked like someone threw some string lights over a dusty old storage shed and called it a day. But you know, it's not the venue that makes a wedding, it's the people, right? Wrong. In this case, the people made everything worse. Now, my stepmom had one simple request for her mom that day. One, she didn't want her drinking. Considering how much of a problem alcohol had been in their relationship, this was kind of a big deal. She'd even gone out of her way to arrange for sparkling juice during the toasts, thinking that would be enough to keep her mom in line. But as you probably guessed, her mom wasn't exactly the follow-the-rules type. While my stepmom was off changing into her reception dress, her mom decided it was party time. I don't know how she got started, but one minute she's sitting there with her fancy sparkling juice, and the next, she's going from table to table, grabbing any abandoned glass of champagne she could find. She wasn't even being subtle about it. She'd just stroll up, grab a half-empty glass, and toss it back like she was at some dive bar during happy hour. At one point, my cousin, a clueless guy who clearly wasn't in on the no-drinking rule, sees her and thinks she's just being the life of the party. So he starts chanting, "Chug, chug, chug," like this was some frat party, and of course, other people join in. Before you know it, there's this group of guests cheering her on as she downs glass after glass. And then, timing is everything. My stepmom walks back into the reception, all dressed up and ready for her big entrance, only to see her mom tipping back the last glass, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand like it's no big deal. You could see it hit her immediately. This mix of disappointment, frustration, and just pure exhaustion. She'd barely made it through the ceremony. And now this? It was like the final punch in the gut. But it didn't stop there. Her mom, now fully buzzed, decides it's the perfect time to give a speech. No one asked her to, but that didn't matter. She staggers up to the front of the room, champagne flute still in hand, and grabs the microphone. You could see my stepmom's face fall. She knew exactly what was coming, but there was no stopping it. So there we were, in the middle of what was supposed to be a celebration, and things were already spiraling. My cousin, bless his heart, quickly realized he'd messed up. The second my stepmom caught sight of her mom chugging that last glass, it was like all the air got sucked out of the room. My cousin saw her expression change. His face went pale, and he just vanished, slipped out of the tent without a word, leaving my stepmom alone to deal with the fallout. What came next was not pretty. My stepmom, who'd already been holding it together with duct tape and sheer will, marched right up to her mom. There was this moment where everything kind of hung in the air, quiet but tense. Like everyone knew something was about to go down, but didn't want to be the one to witness it. And then it happened. The hushed yell. They tried to keep their voices low, but there's only so much you can whisper when you're that mad. My stepmom's face was red, her hands shaking as she pointed at her mom. And her mom, she just shrugged, laughing it off like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. This was the one thing she asked her mom not to do, and she'd done it anyway. After a few minutes of this back and forth, you could see my stepmom's resolve start to crack. Her eyes filled with tears, and before anyone could even react, she turned on her heel and stormed out. I remember watching her, dressed in this beautiful white reception dress, just walking straight out the front of the venue and heading to her car. I heard the door slam from where I was standing, and then nothing. She just sat in the car for about 20 minutes, probably crying her eyes out, trying to pull herself together. Meanwhile, while all that was happening, a whole different storm was brewing. My dad's mom, my grandma, had finally shown up. Now, to understand why her arrival was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire, you have to know a little about her relationship with my dad. To say it was complicated is putting it mild. My dad had always had issues with her, but things got even worse when he started dating my stepmom. My grandmother hated her from the beginning, thought she was beneath him, and never missed an opportunity to remind him how much of a mistake the relationship was. So, as you can imagine, the wedding wasn't exactly her favorite event. I don't know what finally pushed her over the edge, but when she walked in and saw my dad, it was like years of frustration just boiled over all at once. She didn't even start with a hello or congratulations. Nope. She went straight into a rant. She started ripping into my dad about everything you could possibly imagine. First, it was that he married my stepmom, someone she never approved of. She actually said, loud enough for half the room to hear, that he had ruined his life by marrying her. Then she moved on to the fact that he supposedly owed her money, which, knowing my dad, wasn't totally out of the question, but it certainly wasn't the time to bring it up. And as if that wasn't enough, she started complaining about how she hadn't been allowed to invite one of her friends to the wedding. Now, I've seen my dad angry before, but this was something different. He was already on edge from everything that had happened with my stepmom and her mom, and here was my grandmother pushing every button he had. He tried to ignore her at first, but she just kept going, louder and louder, until finally he snapped. He turned around and in front of everyone told her to fudge off, though, trust me, he didn't say fudge. You could feel the whole room freeze. My grandmother stood there for a moment, shocked, and then she just stormed out, fuming. As she left, she knocked over one of the centerpieces on her way out, sending a vase of flowers crashing to the floor. The whole thing felt like something out of a bad movie. So, at this point, my stepmom's still out in the car. My grandmother's just stormed off in a fit of rage. And my dad? Well, he's standing there in the middle of it all, looking like he's about ready to explode. You could see it in his face. This wasn't just about the wedding, or my grandmother, or anything that had happened that day. This was about years and years of pent-up anger and resentment. It was all finally coming to a head, right there in that dusty old barn. I remember standing off to the side, just watching everything unfold, feeling completely helpless. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. You want to do something, stop it somehow, but you can't. It's already too far gone. And of course, while all this drama was unfolding, the rest of the guests were trying to pretend like nothing was happening. You could hear people whispering, awkwardly shuffling around, trying to make small talk as if they weren't witnessing the total collapse of a wedding. When my stepmom finally came back after her 20-minute break, you could tell she was trying to hold it together. Her face was still red and puffy from crying, and her hands were trembling as she smoothed down her dress. You'd think, after everything that had already gone wrong, things would start to settle down, that maybe my dad would offer her a little comfort, or at least try to make the best of what was left of the night. But no, this is my dad we're talking about. Instead of being understanding, or even pretending to be, he did what he always did when things didn't go his way. He turned his anger on. I guess he needed someone to blame. And in his mind, she was the easiest target. He marched over to her, and right in front of everyone, started laying into her. He accused her of being a baby for crying and storming off, like she hadn't just been humiliated in front of all their family and friends. But he didn't stop. In true paranoid fashion, he went even darker, hinting that maybe she hadn't just been crying. Maybe she'd been sneaking off on him with someone else. Like seriously, after everything that had happened that day, he thought that was a real possibility. The poor woman couldn't win. She was already walking on eggshells, trying to hold herself together, and here he was, accusing her of God knows what. And to make it worse, she knew how he was. She knew if she got upset again, or God forbid, if she left the room for even a second, he'd take it as proof that she was disappearing on him, like she was intentionally causing some scene. So she spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of the reception, barely speaking, doing everything she could to stay visible enough so he wouldn't accuse her of leaving. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on the dance floor, trying not to cry, trying not to do anything that might set him off again. It was painful to watch. I mean, here's this woman who had clearly already been through hell in her life, now stuck in this mess of a wedding that was supposed to be her fresh start, and it was unraveling faster than anyone could keep up. You could see it in the way she sat there, the way she kept her eyes downcast and avoided looking at anyone for too long. She was trapped. And my dad, instead of being the person to help her out of that, was the one pushing her deeper into it. I think by that point, the guests were just trying to pretend everything was normal. There were a few awkward dances, a couple of half-hearted toasts, but the energy was gone. People were whispering, sneaking glances at my dad and stepmom, like they were waiting for the next explosion. Some of the guests, mostly from my stepmom's side, left early. They probably figured they'd seen enough, and honestly, I don't blame them. As the night dragged on, it just got more uncomfortable. My dad drank more, which, as you can imagine, only made things worse. He wasn't a happy drunk by any stretch of the imagination. The more he drank, the angrier he got, muttering under his breath, glaring at anyone who looked at him the wrong way. My stepmom stayed in her corner, surrounded by a few of her friends who were trying to cheer her up, but it was clear she was done. Mentally, emotionally, she was already checked out. I remember at one point my aunt, my dad's sister, tried to pull him aside, maybe to calm him down or at least get him to stop making a scene. She told him to let it go, to stop picking at my stepmom and just enjoy the rest of the night. But in typical fashion, he brushed her off. He didn't want to hear it. He was convinced in his mind that he was the victim, that everyone else was overreacting, and that somehow he was the one being wronged. Looking back on it, it's no wonder their marriage only lasted 6 months. They'd been dating for nearly 10 years, but something about finally tying the knot seemed to magnify all the cracks that had been there from the start. It was like, as soon as they made it official, all the things they'd been avoiding or pretending didn't matter came rushing to the surface, and it all unraveled in a matter of weeks. The wedding was just the start. Things went downhill fast after that. My dad got more controlling, more suspicious. He started accusing my stepmom of all kinds of things, cheating, lying, hiding things from him, none of which were true. But that didn't matter to him. My stepmom, already emotionally exhausted, couldn't take it. She tried for a while to make it work, but after months of the same fights, the same accusations, she finally packed her things and left. Honestly, I think everyone saw it coming. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was everything that led up to all the years of dysfunction, the unresolved issues, the toxic dynamic between them. It all caught up with them in the end. The wedding was just the final nail in the coffin. It was hard to watch, even as someone who wasn't directly involved. It was exhausting just being in the middle of it, watching two people who probably should never have been together in the first place try to force something that was doomed from the start. In a weird way, I think the wedding was almost a relief, like it finally gave them the excuse they needed to acknowledge what had been broken all along.